My stepson stood at the head of my own dinner table and said to my face, "You lived too long. You're just furniture now. Nursing home by Friday." He thought I was a confused old man who had already signed everything away. He didn't know I had been watching every room, every conversation, every move for 14 months. And when Friday finally came, he found out what it means to underestimate a man who designed the house he was standing in. I'm grateful you chose to spend your time here. Let me know in the comments, what country or city are you joining from today? Every single answer makes this community feel like home. Quick note, some elements of this story are fictional, shaped for entertainment and educational value. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message underneath is something I hope stays with you. The room is 12 square meters. I know because I measured it myself. Not when they moved me up here, but 30 years ago, when I designed this house and designated this space as a storage room for Margaret's seasonal decorations. Christmas boxes, Thanksgiving tablecloths. The kind of things you keep because you think you'll always have the occasions to use them. I sit in the only chair, a wooden one with a cracked left armrest, and look out through the small window. It's barely 6 in the morning. Virginia winter doesn't announce itself. It seeps in through the gaps around window frames, through the thin space between floorboards and baseboard, through the single blanket I haven't bothered to replace with something warmer. Below, the grounds stretch out in the gray pre-dawn light. The garden I designed, the stone pathways I specified, the angle of the back porch roof calculated precisely so that afternoon light would fall on the wicker chair where Margaret liked to read. The wicker chair is gone. Diana replaced it with a cast iron patio set gray and geometric ordered from a catalog. Functional, impersonal. Exactly like everything else she's brought into this house over the past 7 years. I hold the new prescription in my hands. 2 additional medications this month. Donepezil and memantine, both at elevated dosages. Dr. Harmon's signature at the bottom, clean and confident. I read through the instructions once then again, not because I need to, but because I've learned that the most important information is rarely in the printed text. I turn the paper over. In the lower right corner, written in Harmon's distinctive leftward slant, in ballpoint pen, rather than the clinic's standard ink, double the dosage if patient still recalls daughter's name. I read it a second time. My expression doesn't change. I've spent 40 years training my face to be unreadable, first in boardrooms when I was negotiating contracts worth 8 figures, then in courtrooms when opposing counsel was trying to rattle me, and now here in a 12 square meter attic room reading a note that confirms what I've suspected for the past 4 months. I fold the prescription and slide it into my jacket pocket. Then I reach under the pile of old clothes stacked against the wall beside the bed and take out the small bottle of vitamin C tablets. I shake it once, approximately 20 remaining. Sufficient. Below Diana's heels, click across the hardwood floor of the main level. Steady, deliberate, metronomic. She's directing the moving crew again. 3rd time this year. Each time another piece of what this house used to be disappears, and something colder, more angular takes its place. I've lived in this room for 14 months. Diana called it a temporary arrangement when she first proposed it. Her voice gentle, her reasoning practical. The master bedroom needed to be closer to the main living areas for household management purposes. I nodded. I didn't argue. People tend to interpret silence as surrender. That is one of the most common and most costly mistakes a person can make. By 8 o'clock, I was downstairs. Diana sat at the large kitchen table, coffee cup in hand, wearing a white cashmere sweater with a wide neck. She looked precisely like what she wanted to look like, a woman enjoying a quiet morning in her own home. Caleb sat at the far end of the table, working through a plate of scrambled eggs, eyes on his phone. He didn't look up when I came in. I took the small chair in the corner. The one without a back support wedged between the wall and the edge of the counter, where Margaret used to keep a basket of cooking magazines. The position wasn't accidental. Nothing in this house is accidental anymore. "The coffee, Walter?" Diana reached for the pot before I answered. "Thank you," I said. She set the cup in front of me, then reached into the kitchen drawer and produced a neat stack of papers clipped together, cleanly typed margins aligned. She slid it across the table toward me, the same unhurried, almost courteous gesture she might use passing a menu at a restaurant. "Next month's room agreement," she said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone discussing something already decided. $2,500 a month, due the 1st. Utilities not included. Caleb bit into a piece of toast. His eyes stayed on his phone. I looked at the document. 28 pages, 4 more than last month, Diana always adds. Every month, quietly, incrementally, the way someone builds a wall by laying a single brick each day, patient enough that no one notices until the wall is already finished, and the door is on the other side of it. I turned the pages slowly. Diana sipped her coffee, watching me with that particular calm she wears like a second skin. That stillness has always been her most effective tool, never pushing, never rushing, just waiting with absolute certainty that the outcome will be what she has already decided it will be. I turned to page 17, read it through, page 18, page 19. I turned to the final page. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, took out my pen, and signed my name on the signature line. No questions, no hesitation, not a single word. Diana and Caleb exchanged a glance across the table, brief, almost imperceptible. The glance of two people confirming to each other that something is going exactly as planned. I saw it. I see everything. I simply choose very carefully what I allow them to know I have seen. Diana collected the document and slid it back into the drawer. "Breakfast is on the counter," she said, already turning away. I picked up my coffee cup. On the final page of that contract, my signature sat precisely on the line, and 3 inches below it, in a font size that required reading glasses neither Diana nor Caleb bothered to carry, was a clause neither of them had read. Clause 14, Section B. I had written it myself, 20 years ago, into the original deed of this house, cross-referenced through 4 subsequent legal documents, and quietly embedded into every tenancy agreement Diana had presented me since the arrangement began. It was patient work. The kind of work that requires absolute certainty that the other party will never read what they are signing. Diana had never disappointed me in that regard. I drank my coffee. Outside the window, the winter light was beginning to come up over the garden, pale and thin, touching the stone pathways I had laid out 3 decades ago. Everything still exactly where I had put it. I thought 6 more days. The workshop is the one place in this house Diana has never entered. She came close once, about 2 years ago, stood at the doorway, one hand on the frame nose wrinkled at the smell of machine oil and metal shavings. "We should have someone clean this out," she said. "Turn it into a proper storage space." I told her the fumes from the solvent compounds were a respiratory hazard without proper ventilation equipment, and that the liability exposure for the property would be significant if anyone became ill inside. I cited a case number fabricated but plausible. Diana nodded slowly and never mentioned it again. People who want to take things from you are most easily managed by making those things appear to cost more than they're worth. I crossed the yard from the main house at 2:30 that afternoon, hands in my jacket pockets, moving with the slightly unsteady gait I had been cultivating for the past 8 months. Not dramatically unsteady, nothing that would invite immediate medical intervention. Just the faint hesitation of a man whose balance is no longer entirely reliable. Caleb had started imitating it behind my back for Diana's benefit about 3 months ago. I had watched him do it twice on the camera footage. It was, I had to admit, a reasonably accurate impression. Inside, I closed the workshop door behind me and stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The smell of oil and cold metal settled around me like something familiar. On the walls, tools hung in rows, wrenches, pliers, a set of socket drivers Margaret had given me for our 22nd anniversary. She'd had them engraved. W.C., the man who fixes everything. I had laughed when I unwrapped them. I hadn't known yet how literal that inscription would become. I crossed to the northeast corner, moved aside the sheet of quarter-inch steel plate leaning against the wall, and crouched down. The floor safe was set into the concrete 12 inches below finished grade. I had poured that section of concrete myself on a Sunday in March, while Margaret was visiting her sister in Roanoke. The safe itself was a standard unit, nothing that would attract attention if someone found it. What made it significant was its contents. I entered the combination and opened it. No cash. Cash is traceable in ways that matter at inconvenient moments. Instead, one USB drive in a matte black case, labeled in my handwriting, with the date I had begun. A manila folder containing 43 photographs, each one time-stamped and cross-referenced to a log entry. And a composition notebook, navy blue cover, 300 pages. The last entry dated yesterday evening. I lifted the notebook and turned to that final entry. Read it through once. The handwriting was mine, small, precise, the same handwriting I had used for 40 years of architectural specifications. Everything was current. Everything was accurate. Everything was in order. I closed the notebook, replaced it in the safe alongside the USB, and the folder sealed the door and slid the steel plate back into position. I straightened up slowly, genuinely slowly, not as performance. 70-year-old knees on cold concrete are 70-year-old knees, regardless of one's circumstances, and stood for a moment looking around the workshop. On the workbench, a small radio played the AM news station at low volume. I kept it running whenever I wasn't in the workshop. Background noise that made the space seem occupied without requiring my presence. Diana and Caleb had long since stopped paying attention to it. Before I left, I stopped at the workshop door and looked back toward the main house. The light in the master bedroom was on the room that had been mine and Margaret's for 23 years and was now Diana's. The curtains were drawn. Through the gap at the edge, I could see the faint blue glow of a television screen. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I turned off the workshop light and walked back across the yard. 5 more days. At 11 o'clock that night, I was lying in the dark in the attic room when the phone vibrated. Not a ring, a vibration only. I had disabled all audio notifications on this particular device 18 months ago. It was a prepaid unit purchased with cash at a truck stop off I-81, replaced every 90 days on a schedule I kept in my head, rather than writing down anywhere. Diana had found the previous one once going through my coat pocket while I was in the bathroom. I had watched her on the corridor camera, seen her turn it over in her hands, then put it back exactly where she found it. She hadn't mentioned it. Neither had I. I picked up the phone on the first vibration. From the earpiece, 3 short knocks. A pause. Then one more. I raised my right hand and knocked twice against the wooden headboard. The line went dead. 11 seconds total. I set the phone face down on the mattress beside me and stared at the ceiling. The plaster up there had a hairline crack running from the east wall to approximately the center of the room. I had noticed it the first week I moved in. It hadn't grown since. Some things once fractured simply hold their position without getting worse. I had never decided whether that was reassuring or not. Downstairs, I could hear Caleb moving around in the room directly below mine. The floor between us was original construction 3/4-inch tongue and groove pine, good for sound transmission in both directions. I heard the familiar sequence chair pulled out keyboard sounds, the particular hollow click of a mouse being worked in short bursts, the pattern of a man refreshing a page, repeatedly waiting for numbers to change. I knew the numbers. I had set them myself. After a few minutes, the keyboard sounds stopped. A pause. Then Caleb's voice, low and sharp, the single syllable of a man who has just seen something on a screen that has confirmed his worst calculation. Then silence. Then the keyboard again, faster this time, the pattern of someone placing another bet to recover what they had just lost. The account he was logged into was registered to a shell entity in Delaware. The shell entity was owned by a holding company in Nevada. The holding company was a subsidiary of Sterling Consolidated LLC, which along with its 6 affiliated operating entities, was ultimately controlled through a blind trust administered by a law firm in Lower Manhattan. The law firm's primary contact for Sterling matters was a junior partner named Sophie Calloway. Sophie had taken her mother's maiden name when she moved to New York. My idea. It had seemed prudent at the time, and the intervening 10 years had confirmed that prudence. I closed my eyes. Below me, Caleb was still typing. 5 more days, I thought again. And he'll still be at that keyboard betting against himself with his own borrowed money right up until the moment the account closes. Dr. Harmon's office was the kind of place designed to communicate trustworthiness through expense. Dark walnut paneling. Framed credentials arranged on the wall with the careful asymmetry of someone who wanted them noticed without appearing to have arranged them. No reception nurse. Harmon handled his private clients himself, which Diana had always described as a sign of his discretion. It was in fact a sign of something else entirely, but I had learned to let people interpret what they see according to what they want to believe. Diana sat in the chair beside the examination table while Harmon worked through the standard cognitive assessment. He held up a card with a simple line drawing on it, a house, a clock, face, a geometric shape, and asked me to identify each one. I answered slowly. Occasionally I paused for slightly too long before responding, or substituted a near synonym for the correct word. Not dramatically, just enough. "What is today's date, Walter?" Harmon asked, pen poised above his notepad. I looked at the wall, then at the window, then back at him. "Tuesday," I said. "I believe it's Tuesday." It was Wednesday. I was aware it was Wednesday. I had been aware of every date, every day of the week, every appointment and deadline for the past 4 months, with the kind of precision that would have satisfied any neurologist in the state of Virginia. Harmon made a note. Diana made a note of her own in the small, leather-bound planner she carried everywhere. When the assessment was finished, Harmon wrote out the new prescription, the same one I had already read that morning in the attic room, and handed it directly to Diana. Not to me. To her. The way you hand a document to the person who is actually in charge of its implementation. Same routine, he said to her, not to me. Morning and evening, with food. "Of course," Diana said. She folded the prescription and placed it in her planner. Then she looked at me with an expression of practiced, sorrowful patience, the expression of a woman carrying a burden she had chosen to carry, without complaint. "Thank you, Michael," she said to Harmon. "First name, 7 years of first names." I sat on the examination table and looked out the window while they spoke in the lowered voices of people who believe the person in the room with them can no longer follow the conversation. Outside, a bare oak tree stood against a white sky. I counted its branches from the lowest fork upward. 17 primary branches, 42 secondary. I had always found that kind of counting useful. It kept the surface of my face neutral, while the rest of my attention was fully occupied elsewhere. "To taper up again next month," Harmon was saying. "At this rate, by spring we'll be fine," Diana said. Her voice carried a quiet certainty that told me the timeline had already been discussed before today. This visit was confirmation, not consultation. I climbed down from the examination table with the careful deliberateness of a man whose proprioception is no longer reliable. Harmon handed me my jacket. "Take care of yourself, Walter," he said. The tone a person uses with someone they no longer expect to require much taking care of. "I'll do my best," I said. On the way home, Diana made a phone call from the front seat. I sat in the back, eyes half closed, breathing slowly. Her voice was low. I caught 3 phrases clearly, "signed already, before Friday," and "he's further along than Michael expected." Then she glanced in the rearview mirror, saw my eyes closed, and continued. In my right hand, inside my jacket pocket, I held a small vitamin C tablet between 2 fingers. I had placed it under my tongue before we left the house that morning. Dinner that evening was lamb chops and roasted vegetables. Diana's housekeeper came on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. The table sat 10. 3 of us occupied one end of it with the specific spatial arrangement that had become standard over the past year, Diana at the side position. She preferred Caleb at the head my chair, though I had stopped pointing that out after the 3rd time, and me at the adjacent corner where the light from the overhead fixture didn't quite reach. I was cutting my lamb chop when Caleb put down his fork. I didn't look up. I had learned to register these pauses without reacting to them, because reaction was precisely what they were designed to produce. "You know what your problem is," he said. Diana continued eating. She didn't tell him to stop. She never told him to stop. That was part of the architecture of it. Caleb provided the volume, Diana provided the silence that gave it permission. I kept cutting. "You lived too long," Caleb said. His voice carried the particular flatness of someone who has rehearsed a speech enough times that it no longer sounds rehearsed. "Useful men know when to step aside. You're just furniture now. Expensive to keep, impossible to move, and nobody actually wants you here." He picked up his fork again. "Mom keeps you around out of pity. I keep you around because she asks me to. The moment she stops asking..." He shrugged. "Nursing home by Friday. Maybe sooner if I can find one with an opening." The dining room was quiet except for the sound of cutlery. Diana set down her wine glass. "Caleb," she said softly, "that's not necessary." The tone of a woman performing the minimal gesture of restraint, required to maintain plausible deniability. Not enough to stop anything, just enough to be remembered as having said something. I placed a piece of lamb on my fork and ate it. It was well seasoned. The housekeeper was a competent cook. I thought about the camera mounted in the upper left corner of the dining room, the one I had installed 4 years ago during a week when Diana and Caleb were in Florida. It fed to an encrypted cloud account, accessible only from my phone and from a laptop in Sophie's New York apartment. The footage was time-stamped, GPS tagged, and automatically backed up every 6 hours to a secondary server in a data center in Ashburn, Virginia. I set down my knife and fork, wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, pushed back my chair and stood up. "Thank you for dinner," I said to no one in particular. I walked to the stairs. Behind me, I heard Caleb exhale the sound of a man who had expected more resistance and wasn't sure whether the lack of it was satisfying or not. I had observed that uncertainty in him before. He wanted reaction. He wanted evidence that his words landed where he aimed them. I didn't give him that. In the attic room, I sat at the small desk and opened the composition notebook I kept in the inside pocket of my jacket, separate from the one in the workshop safe. This one, smaller, used only for contemporaneous records. I wrote the date, the time, the location. Then I wrote down Caleb's words verbatim from memory, punctuated accurately. At the bottom of the entry, I wrote "Camera upper left dining room. File 47. I capped the pen and looked at what I had written. Enough, I thought. Almost enough. I left the house at 8:15, telling Diana I needed air. She looked up from her coffee with the measured attentiveness of someone monitoring a variable. "It's cold," she said. "Take your scarf." "I'll be fine," I said. She watched me put on my coat. I moved with the careful, slightly effortful deliberateness I had been performing for months. The gait of a man for whom a 3-mile walk would be inadvisable, and a half-mile walk, a minor undertaking requiring prior consideration. Diana watched until I reached the front door. Then she went back to her phone. The post office was 2.8 miles from the house. I walked it in 44 minutes, a pace I could have halved if the performance hadn't required otherwise. The cold was genuine enough, and I let it settle into my shoulders and hands the way it does at 70 when you've been sitting in an underheated room for too long. Some things don't require acting. The post office on Millbrook Road was the kind of small branch that serves a semi-rural community. 6 windows, 2 usually staffed a wall of P.O. boxes along the left side. I had rented Box 447 3 years ago under a business name, a sole proprietorship registered in my daughter's name, used for no actual commercial purpose, existing only to provide a mailing address that neither Diana nor anyone connected to her had any reason to associate with me. I worked the combination open the box and removed the single envelope inside. No return address. New York postmark 2 days prior. I recognized the weight of it. Sophie calibrated her envelopes deliberately, each one a specific weight, corresponding to the volume of material inside, so I would know before opening it approximately how much had changed since the last update. This one was heavier than last week's. I took it to the bench outside, sat down, and opened it. The first document was a corporate registry summary. 3 companies, all Delaware registrations, all showing the same registered agent address in Wilmington. The second document was a financial transaction summary, payments from an account in Caleb's name to each of the 3 companies over the past 18 months. The third document was a single page with 2 columns. On the left, the 3 company names. On the right, a chain of ownership that moved through 4 intermediate entities before arriving at the bottom of the page at a single line. Sterling Consolidated LLC Ultimate Beneficial Owner. I read the page twice. Then I sat back on the bench and looked at the bare trees along the road. In the 17 years since I had established Sterling Consolidated, it had served as the holding structure for my commercial real estate portfolio, my equity positions in the architecture firm I founded and subsequently stepped back from, and a network of 6 operating subsidiaries that Sophie had spent the past decade quietly reinforcing and legally insulating. One of those subsidiaries, established 4 years ago at my specific direction, operated 3 online gaming platforms under separate brand names. Caleb had been a registered user of all 3 since their launch. I had never told Sophie the full extent of what I found amusing about that particular arrangement. She knew enough. She had structured it after all. But there are some things a father keeps to himself, not out of secrecy, but out of a sense that some ironies are too complete to require comment. I folded the documents back into the envelope, tucked it inside my jacket against my chest, and stood up. On the way home, I passed the flower shop on the corner of Millbrook and Route 7. In the window, a bucket of white chrysanthemums, the kind Margaret had grown along the back fence every summer for as long as I could remember. She had called them her reliable flowers. They come back every year without being asked, she used to say. Unlike most things worth having, I stood at the window for a moment. Then I continued walking. Diana thought I was sleeping at 2:30 in the afternoon. This was a reasonable assumption on her part. I had established over a period of several months a pattern of afternoon fatigue that made a post-lunch nap appear not only plausible, but medically consistent with my supposed condition. I would go upstairs at approximately 1:15, and Diana, who monitored my movements with the attentiveness of someone managing an investment, would hear the attic door close and proceed with whatever she had scheduled for the afternoon. What she had not accounted for was the difference between the sound of the attic door closing and the sound of a person actually being inside the attic. The door to the second-floor study was not fully latched. A gap of perhaps 2 inches. Enough. Diana's voice, first low and precise. The bank appointment is confirmed for Friday, 10 o'clock. Caleb and the authorization paperwork. He signed the financial power of attorney in September. It's been notarized and on file with Morrison's office since October. Friday, we present it, initiate the transfer of management authority over the Sterling portfolio, and the refinancing proceeds from there. A pause. The sound of papers being moved. The total asset position is approximately $28 million depending on current valuations. Morrison estimates the process takes 30 days once the bank accepts the authorization. And if he won't, Diana said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of absolute certainty. He doesn't know what he signed in September, Caleb. He barely knew what day it was by then. A silence. "Redayo," Caleb said. "Ritagti," Diana confirmed. I stood in the hallway 3 feet from the study door and listened to the particular sound of 2 people who believe they are completely alone. Then I turned and walked back toward the attic stairs, each footstep placed with the care of a man who has spent 40 years designing floors and knows exactly which boards will carry weight in silence. In the attic room, I sat down on the edge of the bed. Friday. 4 days from now. Diana had a timeline. I had a timeline. The difference between our 2 timelines was approximately 16 hours, the margin by which Sophie's filing at the bank would precede Diana's appointment with Morrison. 16 hours across, 40 years of preparation felt like a comfortable margin. I looked at the ceiling. The hairline crack ran from east wall to center, same as always, holding its position without getting worse. 4 more days, I thought. Eleanor Voss had lived next door for 31 years. She had moved in the summer. Margaret and I finished the landscaping on the east side of the property, I remembered, because she had come over with a plate of oatmeal cookies and stood at the garden fence watching me plant the last of the boxwood hedges. "You do your own yard work," she had said, in the tone of someone making a favorable assessment. Margaret had come out with iced tea, and the 3 of us had stood there in the August heat, talking about nothing in particular for the better part of an hour. That was the beginning of a friendship that had outlasted, as it turned out, almost everything else from that period of my life. Eleanor was 75 now, a widow for 9 years. She still made her own preserves, still maintained her garden with the competitive attentiveness of a woman who had won the Neighborhood Association's landscaping commendation 4 years running, and still on occasion appeared at the fence between our properties with something wrapped in foil and a look on her face that communicated considerably more than whatever she said out loud. I was walking the east path, my standard afternoon circuit, ostensibly for the mild exercise my supposed condition made advisable actually, because it was the one part of the property where I could move without being observed from the main house windows when I heard her voice. "Walter." She was standing at the fence, a round tin covered in aluminum foil, balanced in both hands. Apple cake. She made it the same way every time, with brown sugar and a specific ratio of cinnamon that she had never written down and claimed to measure by smell. "Eleanor," I said, from the direction of the back porch, Diana's voice, "Thank you, Mrs. Voss, but Walter is watching his sugar intake." Eleanor looked at Diana. Then she looked at me. There was a quality to her gaze at that moment, steady, appraising, carrying the weight of 3 decades of observation, that communicated something Diana, standing 20 feet away, would not have been able to read. I gave Eleanor the faintest inclination of my head. Nearly imperceptible. She had learned to read those years ago. "Well, leave it here then," Eleanor said pleasantly, setting the tin on the fence post. "He can decide for himself." Diana went back inside. The screen door closed with its characteristic rattle. Eleanor's voice dropped to just above conversational. "She looked at me the same way this morning." A pause. "The same way she looked at me 20 years ago, when I used to come by to check on Margaret." I took the tin from the fence post. "I know," I said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that holds something inside it, something that has been held a long time and has grown heavy with the holding. "Walter," she said, "I think about that night." "I know you do," I said. "So do I." She looked at me carefully. Are you... She stopped, started again. Is there anything I can do? I looked down at the tin in my hands. The foil was still warm from the oven. There might be, I said. Would you be willing to come by the house on Friday around 3 o'clock? Something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular recognition of a person who has been waiting for a specific question for a very long time and has just heard it asked. I'll bring more cake, she said. I nodded. Bring the cake. I watched her walk back to her own house. Her gait unhurried her back straight in the way of a woman who had decided at some point that age was not going to take her posture from her. Then I carried the tin to the workshop, where I ate 2 pieces standing at the workbench, listening to the AM radio, and thought about the envelope I was going to ask Eleanor to sign before Friday. Caleb was still awake at 11 when I came downstairs for a glass of water. He was in the living room, stretched across the larger of the 2 sofas, the kind of horizontal occupancy that announces ownership of a space. The television was running at low volume some sports program, the sound reduced to background murmur. On the coffee table, a bottle of scotch, approximately 1/3 remaining a rocks glass with a residue of ice, and his phone face up showing a betting interface I recognized. He looked up when I came in, registered me with the brief, dismissive attention he usually gave to furniture, the category he had recently assigned me to, and looked back at the television. I poured my water at the kitchen counter and stood for a moment in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, which afforded a clean sightline to the sofa without requiring me to enter the room fully. Caleb poured himself another measure of scotch. His movements had the careful precision of someone who is more drunk than he looks and knows it. My father. He said not to me particularly, more to the middle distance, the way people speak when they've been drinking alone long enough that the room starts to feel like an audience. You want to know something? He died before I was born. That's what my mother always said. He took a long drink. Heart attack at 32. Genetic. Nothing anyone could have done. He set the glass down. I used to think that was the saddest story I ever heard. A man who never got to meet his own son. A short, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. Now I think maybe my mother told me what she needed me to believe. The room was quiet, except for the television's low murmur. People do that, I said. Caleb turned his head and looked at me. Actually looked at me for the first time in recent memory with something other than contempt or performative dismissal. Just for a moment. Then his eyes went unfocused, and he looked back at the ceiling. Whatever, he said, doesn't matter. He was asleep within 3 minutes. I could tell by the change in his breathing, the specific rhythm of someone who has drunk just enough to fall unconscious, without warning, the glass still loose in his hand. I stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. In the workshop safe in the manila folder behind the composition notebook, there was a document I had obtained 14 months ago through a contact Sophie had developed during her time clerking for a federal judge in the Southern District. It was a certified copy of a birth record cross-referenced with a federal inmate registry. The man listed as Caleb's biological father was not dead. He was 57 years old, currently housed at a federal correctional institution in Cumberland, Maryland, 22 years into a 35-year sentence for wire fraud and financial crimes, affecting more than 400 individual victims. He had been sentenced 8 months after Caleb was born. Diana had been in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had confirmed this through court records. I set my water glass down on the kitchen counter, turned off the kitchen light, and went back upstairs. 4 more days, I thought, and every piece of it in its place. The second envelope from Sophie arrived on Thursday morning. Same weight protocol as always, this one lighter than the previous, which told me before I opened it that the update was confirmatory rather than new material. Sophie had learned that discipline from me years ago when I explained to her that the most dangerous communication is the one that contains more than the recipient needs at that moment. Send exactly what serves the next step, I had told her. Nothing ahead of its time. She had absorbed that lesson with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. I sat on the bench outside the post office and opened the envelope in the pale morning light. Inside, a single folded sheet. 2 columns, 8 rows, clean formatting. On the left, transaction dates. On the right, amounts transferred from Caleb's personal account to the 3 gaming platforms over the previous 30 days. The total at the bottom of the right column was $422,000. I looked at that number for a moment. Not with satisfaction. Satisfaction would have been premature, and I had spent 40 years training myself against premature responses of any kind. But with the particular recognition of a man who has set a mechanism in motion and observed it functioning exactly as designed. Caleb believed he was losing to the house. In the conventional sense, he was correct. The house in every case wins. What he did not know, what he had no way of knowing, because the ownership structure was specifically engineered to be untraceable without a federal subpoena and the relevant expertise to interpret what the subpoena returned, was that in this particular arrangement, he was the house's single largest revenue source, and the house was mine. I folded the sheet, replaced it in the envelope, and tucked it inside my jacket. On the walk home, I passed the flower shop again. The white chrysanthemums were still in the window. Same bucket, I thought, or a new one it was impossible to tell from the street. I paused for a moment, then kept walking. There would be time for flowers later. After Friday, there would be time for a great many things. I was under the kitchen sink at 11:45 when Caleb came in. The kitchen faucet had developed a slow drip from the base of the hot water supply line, a compression fitting that had worked itself slightly loose, a 10-minute repair requiring a basin wrench and a quarter turn of adjustment. Diana had mentioned it to a plumber 2 weeks ago. The plumber had come, looked at it, quoted $800 for a full fixture assessment, and Diana had scheduled him to return the following week. I had watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. I slid out from under the cabinet as Caleb came through from the hallway. He was wearing the clothes he'd slept in, his hair uncombed, carrying his phone in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. He stopped when he saw me on the floor, the basin wrench in my hand, the cabinet door open. I said nothing. I set the wrench down, stood up carefully, and began wiping my hands on the shopcloth I'd tucked into my belt. Caleb looked at me, then at the open cabinet, then back at me. "You know what this is," he said. He set his coffee on the counter and leaned against it, crossing his arms with the casual authority of someone who has decided to perform a point. 50 years of grease under your fingernails, and what do you have to show for it?" He gestured at the cabinet. "An attic room and a social security check. My mother built this life. You just..." He paused as though searching for the precise word, and I had the clear impression the pause was rehearsed, existed in it. I folded the shopcloth and set it on the counter. "Sign it," he said, reaching into the back pocket of his jeans and producing a folded document, next month's room agreement, the one Diana had prepared yesterday evening. I had heard the printer running from the hallway. "Or I'll start billing you for the electricity you've been wasting in that attic room. 1,200 square feet of HVAC for one person who sleeps 14 hours a day." He set the document on the counter beside me and tapped it once with 2 fingers. "Sign it, old man." I looked at the document. Then I picked up my pen from the counter. I had left it there when I came in to do the repair, a habit so long established it had ceased to be deliberate, and I signed my name on the signature line. Caleb watched me do it with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis they already believed. He picked up the document, folded it, and put it back in his pocket. "Was there anything wrong with the faucet?" he asked almost as an afterthought, nodding toward the cabinet. "Some compression fitting," I said. "It's fine now." He looked at me for a moment, The brief, slightly uncomfortable look of a man who has just won something and finds the winning less satisfying than he expected. Then he picked up his coffee and left the kitchen. I stood at the counter and listened to his footsteps cross the living room and go up the stairs. Then I took the small notebook from my jacket pocket and wrote the date, the time, and the location. I wrote Caleb's words from memory in the order he had said them, with the punctuation placed where his voice had placed it. At the bottom of the entry, I wrote camera upper right kitchen, file 61. I capped the pen. I thought about the footage from the upper right kitchen camera, the angle that caught the counter, the cabinet, and the full length of the kitchen from the doorway through to the window above the sink. Clear sight lines. Good resolution. Timestamp embedded in the metadata. I thought about file 47 from the dining room, and files 23 and 31 and 38 and 44 and 52. The accumulated record of 14 months of documented conduct. Each entry cross-referenced each timestamp, verified each location, confirmed by GPS metadata from the camera units themselves. 61 files. I had told Sophie when we first began this that I would not move until I had more than I needed. Not enough more than enough. The distinction mattered. Enough is the minimum required to win. More than enough is the margin that makes winning inevitable. I looked at the number I had written. 61, I thought. That's more than enough. I closed the notebook and slid it back into my jacket. Through the kitchen window, the garden was gray and still in the late morning light. 3 more days until Friday. 72 hours approximately until Diana sat down across from a bank officer who would inform her that the authorization she had brought with her was no longer operative. I turned on the kitchen faucet. No drip. The fitting held. I dried my hands, picked up the basin wrench, and went back to the workshop. I had 2 phones. The first was the one Diana knew about, a standard smartphone 4 years old, kept on the kitchen counter during the day and on the nightstand at night, containing nothing that would surprise anyone who looked through it. Contact list of perhaps 40 names, mostly people I no longer spoke to regularly. A handful of news applications. A weather app. The kind of phone that communicates to anyone who examines it the digital life of a man whose world has contracted to its present dimensions. The second phone was the prepaid unit I kept in the workshop, changed every 90 days, purchased cash, registered to nothing. I used the second phone that afternoon from the workshop, seated at the back of the bench, where the angle from the single high window did not allow line of sight from the main house. It was a call I had scheduled internally, not with Sophie, but with the attorney who had served as the independent trustee for the Sterling estate documents since their original execution. A brief call, confirmatory in nature. I needed to verify that the filing Sophie had prepared was ready to transmit on Friday morning, and that the notarized copies were in the correct hands. They were. Everything was in order. What I had not planned, what I had in fact calculated as a specific probability and assigned a roughly 40% likelihood, was that Diana would pick up the kitchen extension at some point during that call. She picked it up at the 2-minute mark. I knew the moment it happened. There is a particular quality to the silence of an open line with an additional listener. A slight change in the ambient sound, a fractional increase in background noise that most people would not notice. I noticed it immediately and adjusted accordingly. The Friday timeline. I said, allowing my voice to carry a specific register of mild anxiety, the tone of a man who is worried about something he doesn't fully understand. The bank. I just want to make sure the documents are in order before the meeting. The attorney, to his credit, had been briefed on the possibility of this scenario. He responded in the neutral, slightly over-explanatory manner we had agreed upon confirmation of the appointment reference to the account documents, and a closing remark about Friday being a firm deadline. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat for a moment in the workshop, listening to the ambient sounds of the property. After approximately 40 seconds, I heard the distinctive rattle of the kitchen screen door, Diana going back out to the garden, or perhaps to her car. The sound of a woman who has just heard something that has confirmed a suspicion and is moving to act on it. Good. I wanted Diana moving faster. A person moving quickly makes decisions with less deliberation. A person making decisions with less deliberation makes mistakes. I had designed this particular piece of the arrangement specifically to accelerate her timeline by approximately 12 hours, which would leave her with less preparation time, fewer contingencies, and a higher probability of arriving at the bank on Friday without the supplemental documentation her lawyer would have advised her to bring if she'd had the extra day to think it through. That evening, Diana told Caleb at dinner, in a voice she kept low, but not low enough. "He's talking to someone about the bank. We need to move the Friday appointment to first thing in the morning. 8 o'clock instead of 10. Can Morrison do 8? Caleb asked. I'll make sure he can, Diana said. I sat at my corner of the table and ate my soup and said nothing. Sophie's filing was scheduled for 7:45. I found the camera that night. I had been in the attic room for perhaps an hour reading, when something in my peripheral vision registered as slightly wrong. It took me a moment to identify what the small, framed photograph on the shelf beside the window, a picture of Margaret and me taken at a conference in Chicago in 1987, had been moved. Not significantly, perhaps an inch to the left of its usual position. Enough that the frame's shadow fell differently on the shelf surface. I set my book down and looked at it. Then I stood across the room and examined the frame without touching it. Behind it, affixed to the wall with a small adhesive mount, was a device approximately the size of a shirt button. Lens facing outward through a gap in the frame's backing. A small indicator light disabled whoever had installed it had taken the precaution of deactivating the visible LED, which told me they had some familiarity with basic concealment protocol. It was a wireless camera unit. Current model available through several consumer electronics retailers for approximately $80. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I picked up the frame, adjusted it back to its original position, 1 inch to the right shadow falling correctly, and set it down. The camera remained exactly where it was, angle unchanged, field of view intact. I stepped back to the center of the room. The camera's field of view, based on the lens type and its position behind the frame, covered approximately 70% of the attic room, the bed, the desk, the chair, the area near the door. The remaining 30% of the corner where I kept the composition notebook and the small box of prepaid phone components fell just outside the frame's left edge. I had placed those items in that corner 8 months ago. Some things require planning. Some things require patience. And some things, the best things, the things that hold together under pressure, require the particular combination of both that comes only from knowing with absolute certainty what the other person is going to do before they do it. I went to the wardrobe and changed into my nightclothes. I moved the way the camera expected me to move, slowly with the minor coordination difficulties, consistent with my documented condition, pausing once to appear briefly disoriented before locating my shirt on the correct hook. I sat on the edge of the bed. I reached for the glass of water on the nightstand with the slightly effortful reach of a man whose fine motor control is declining. Then I lay down. I stared at the ceiling for a moment. The hairline crack east wall to center unchanged. Before I reached for the lamp, I turned my head and looked directly at the camera for exactly 1 second. Not long enough to be certain if someone were watching the footage later, whether it was deliberate or simply the unfocused gaze of an old man looking at a picture frame before sleep. Then I turned off the lamp. In the dark, I thought about Diana watching that footage tomorrow morning and seeing exactly what she expected to see. I thought about how completely a person can be deceived by their own certainty. 3 more days, I thought, and they're watching me sleep. The third envelope was the thinnest of the 3. I had expected this. Sophie's communication discipline meant that when the envelope was thin, the content was either very simple or very final, and by Thursday morning, with 2 days remaining, there was nothing left that needed to be complicated. The work of complexity had been done over 10 years. What remained was confirmation. I opened it on the bench outside the post office in the same cold morning light that had accompanied every one of these readings. Inside, 2 pages stapled. The first was a certified copy of a birth record from a county in West Virginia dated 30 years ago. The second was a page from the Federal Bureau of Prisons Inmate Locator, a printout showing a name, a registration number, a facility, and a projected release date. The release date was 19 years from now. I read both pages carefully, though I had seen preliminary versions of both documents before. There is a difference between preliminary intelligence and certified documentation, the same difference between a blueprint and a finished building. One is what you intend, the other is what actually stands and can be verified by anyone who walks up and looks at it. The name on the birth record in the field designated father matched the name on the Bureau of Prisons record exactly. Diana had told Caleb his father died of a heart attack at 32 before Caleb was born. The man was in fact 57 years old in reasonable health, according to the most recent facility medical report Sophie had obtained through a public records request, and had been incarcerated since Caleb was 8 months old. Diana had attended the sentencing hearing. The court record confirmed her presence in the gallery. She had gone home from that courthouse to a different house in a different city and told a story. She had maintained that story for 30 years, with the same quiet, absolute consistency she brought to everything she did. I had known Diana for 22 of those 30 years, and in that time, I had come to understand that her most remarkable quality was not her patience or her planning, formidable as both were. It was her complete absence of doubt. She never second-guessed, never reconsidered, never, as far as I could observe, experienced the ordinary human uncertainty that causes most people to leave small gaps in their constructed versions of events. Those gaps are where the truth eventually finds its way through. Diana left no gaps. She was in that specific sense the most disciplined person I had ever encountered. I folded both pages, replaced them in the envelope, and stood up from the bench. I would add them to the workshop safe this afternoon. They would join the USB drive, the photograph folder, and the composition notebooks, the accumulated material of a decade of careful, patient construction. After Friday, the safe's contents would be transferred to Sophie's custody, then to the FBI field office in Richmond, where an agent named Kowalski had been waiting for the complete file for the past 6 months. Kowalski had told Sophie at their last meeting that he had worked financial crimes and elder abuse cases for 19 years and had never seen a documentation package as thorough as the one we were assembling. Sophie had thanked him professionally and said nothing else. She got that from me, the understanding that a compliment about your preparation is not a reason to discuss your preparation. On the walk home, I did not stop at the flower shop. I was thinking about the garage. I found the boxes at 2 o'clock. I had gone to the garage to retrieve a specific hand tool, a small torque wrench I needed for a minor adjustment on the workshop press, and I saw them immediately. 4 cardboard boxes, medium-sized, stacked against the left wall near the shelving unit. Each one sealed with brown packing tape. Each one labeled in Diana's handwriting with a single word, donation. I set down my jacket and opened the top box. Inside, the silver-framed photograph from the main hallway. Margaret and I at Sophie's college graduation. Sophie in her cap and gown. Margaret laughing at something just outside the frame, myself, with my hand on Sophie's shoulder, looking at the camera with the particular expression of a man who is trying to appear less proud than he actually is. Below it, wrapped in newspaper, the pair of hand-painted ceramic bookends Margaret had bought at a market in Savannah on our 25th anniversary. Below those 3 more framed photographs, a small wooden clock that had sat on the mantelpiece since we moved in, and a glass paperweight containing a pressed violet. Margaret had received it from her mother, and her mother had received it from hers. I went through all 4 boxes. It took approximately 20 minutes. When I had finished, I sat down on the concrete floor of the garage and held the graduation photograph in both hands. Margaret was laughing in that photograph. Not the polite, composed laugh she used in professional settings, but the real one, head tilted slightly back, eyes almost closed. The laugh that meant something had genuinely caught her by surprise and delighted her. Sophie had said something. I couldn't remember now what it was. I remembered the sound of it, and I remembered Margaret's face, and I remembered thinking at the time that if I could choose a single image to carry forward from that day, it would be that one. I had chosen correctly, as it turned out. I could still see it exactly. I stood up. I carried the graduation photograph, the ceramic bookends, and the pressed violet paperweight back to the workshop. The other items I replaced carefully in the boxes, resealed the tape as closely as I could to its original line, and stacked them back against the wall in the same configuration I had found them. In the workshop, I opened the safe and placed the graduation photograph inside, face up on top of the manila folder. I looked at it for a moment, Margaret laughing, Sophie's cap slightly askew, the particular brightness of that afternoon. This goes back on the wall, I said quietly to the photograph, to the room, to whatever remained of the conversation I had been conducting with Margaret in my head for the past 20 years. After Friday, it goes back exactly where it was. I had made this promise once before. On the drive home from the hospital 20 years ago, through the particular empty quality of early morning streets when the world hasn't started yet, and you are the only person moving through it. I had made it then, without knowing what it would require to keep it. Now I knew. I closed the safe, replaced the steel plate, and stood up. 2 more days, I thought. 2 more days, and I keep my promise. Eleanor's message came at 7:40 in the morning. She texted with the careful deliberateness of a 75-year-old woman who had learned to use a smartphone late in life and approached each message as a small act of composition, punctuation. Correct words, fully spelled out, no abbreviations. The message read, Walter, I think you should see something. I'm sending a photograph. It was posted to the Hillcrest neighborhood group last night. I won't say what I think of it. You'll form your own opinion. The photograph arrived 30 seconds later. A screenshot of a social media post, the profile picture showing Diana in a garden setting, smiling. The post itself read, It's heartbreaking when someone you've devoted your life to turns on you. Some days, the weight of it is almost too much to carry. Please keep our family in your prayers. We just need peace and stability right now. Below the text, a photograph of the house. Our house. The front elevation, the stone pathway, the boxwood hedges I had planted 30 years ago, framed in the warm, late afternoon light that fell on that side of the property between 4 and 5 o'clock. The post had 47 comments. Eleanor had not sent me those, but I could infer their content from the pattern expressions of sympathy offers, of support, the particular vocabulary of communal consolation that social media had refined into a precise and frictionless instrument. I read the post twice. Then I set the phone down on the attic desk and sat for a moment, with my hands flat on the surface. I was not angry. Anger requires surprise as its fuel, and I had not been surprised by Diana in a very long time. What I felt was something closer to recognition, the particular recognition of watching a person reveal in their final moves exactly the shape of how they think. Diana had posted this because she was accelerating. She was building a public record of victimhood, establishing a social context in which any action she took against me would be understood by anyone who had seen the post as the reasonable response of a devoted wife to an unreasonable husband. It was competent work, methodical, consistent with everything else she had done. It was also, I noted, the first time she had made a move I had not specifically anticipated. I had expected a reputation maneuver. It was a logical step in her sequence. But I had expected it to come through the neighborhood directly through conversation, rather than a public post. The post was a slight escalation beyond what I had modeled. I picked up the phone and typed back to Eleanor, "Thank you. Would you be available Friday at 3 o'clock? I have something I'd like you to bring." Eleanor's reply came within 2 minutes. "I'll bring the apple cake." I put the phone away and went downstairs. Diana brought my medication at 8:30 as she did every morning. The ritual had been consistent for 4 months. She would appear at the attic door with a small glass of water and 3 tablets in a ceramic dish, white oval, identical in appearance to the vitamin C tablets I kept concealed beneath the clothes pile. She would stand in the doorway while I took them, watching with the calm attentiveness of a person administering a necessary process, and then collect the empty dish and leave. I had disrupted this ritual from the beginning, though not in a way Diana could have detected. This morning I heard her footsteps on the attic stairs at 8:27. I had been ready since 8:15. Seated in the wooden chair, composition notebook open on the desk, to a blank page, pen in hand, the picture of a man attempting with diminishing success to maintain a journaling habit. On the desk beside the notebook, my regular morning water glass already half empty. The vitamin C tablet was already under my tongue. Diana opened the door. "Good morning, Walter." She crossed to the desk and set the ceramic dish down. 3 white tablets. "How did you sleep?" "Not well," I said. The slight effortfulness in my voice was genuine enough. I had in fact slept poorly, though not for the reasons she would assume. "The medication should help with that," she said. "Eventually." I picked up the 3 tablets from the dish, placed them in my mouth, picked up the water glass, and swallowed. Diana watched. I set the glass down. "Thank you," I said. She collected the dish and left. Her footsteps descended the stairs with the measured pace of a woman who has no reason to hurry, because everything is proceeding according to plan. I waited until I heard the sound of the kitchen below, the particular acoustic signature of the ground floor, carrying up through the attic floor. And then I went to the bathroom, filled a glass of water from the tap, and leaned over the sink. 3 white tablets. Dry, uncoated, no time release mechanism. Harmon ordered them this way. Specifically, I had determined, because uncoated tablets dissolve more readily and are more difficult to recover if a patient attempts to expel them after the fact. I had been expelling them after the fact for 4 months. I placed the tablets in the small labeled Ziploc bag I kept in the bathroom cabinet behind the box of cotton swabs, the same location I had used since the beginning, chosen because Diana's search of the attic room, which I had identified through camera footage occurring on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks into the arrangement, had not extended to the bathroom cabinet's secondary shelf. I sealed the bag and held it up to the light. 91 tablets. 4 months of daily doses. Each one in its own dated compartment, the dates written in the small, precise handwriting I used for everything that mattered. 91 tablets, each one representing a day on which Diana and Harmon believed they were incrementally achieving something. 91 days of documented attempted chemical incapacitation, each tablet, its own data point, the entire collection cross-referenced to Harmon's prescription records, Diana's pharmacy receipts, and the camera footage from the attic room showing the daily medication ritual. I had told Sophie about the tablets 6 months ago during one of our early planning sessions. She had been quiet for a moment, and then said in the careful voice she used when she was managing her own reaction, "Dad, that's a federal charge." "I know," I had said. "That's why I've been keeping them." I replaced the bag behind the cotton swabs and straightened up. In the mirror, I looked at my own face for a moment. The face of a 70-year-old man who had spent the past 14 months performing a careful, sustained, and entirely deliberate simulation of his own decline. The face showed the work. There were lines there that hadn't been there 2 years ago, a hollowness around the eyes that came from sleeping in an underheated room on an inadequate mattress, and eating whatever Diana's housekeeper prepared without complaint. Some of the performance had cost me more than I had anticipated. I thought about Friday, about Sophie walking into that bank at 7:45, about Eleanor sitting in the front row of the living room at 3 o'clock with her apple cake and her notarized statement. I thought about the ceramic dish with 3 white tablets collected every morning by a woman who had never once considered that the person she was medicating might have reasons of his own for cooperating with the process. One more day, I thought. One more day and it's done. I told Diana I had a doctor's appointment. Not with Harmon, a different doctor, a general practitioner I had seen twice in the past year for purposes that were entirely legitimate and entirely unrelated to the current situation, which gave the appointment a verifiable paper trail if Diana chose to check. She did not ask for details. She handed me my scarf from the hook by the door with the patient attentiveness of a woman managing a dependent, and I thanked her and left. The coffee shop was on Merchant Street, 5 blocks from the medical building I had listed as my destination. I had chosen it 18 months ago when we were establishing the protocol for direct meetings far enough from the house that an accidental encounter with anyone Diana knew was unlikely close enough to a legitimate errand that my presence in that part of town required no separate explanation. A corner table rear section sightline to both entrances. Sophie had identified it. She had her mother's instinct for rooms. She was already there when I arrived. 10 years is a long time. It is also, under certain circumstances, not very long at all. Sophie was 32 now. She had Margaret's cheekbones and my eyes and a quality of stillness in her posture that she had developed on her own through a decade of work I had watched from a distance and been proud of, in the way that fathers are proud of things that exceed what they had the right to expect. Her hair was pulled back. She was wearing a gray blazer over a dark shirt, a leather portfolio open on the table in front of her, a pen in her right hand. She looked up when I came in. We didn't embrace. We had not embraced at any of our previous meetings, and this one was not different. Not because there was no warmth between us, but because we had both understood from the beginning of this arrangement that sentiment and strategy occupy different compartments, and that mixing them even in a private setting was a habit that could develop costs. "You look well," I said, sitting down across from her. "So do you," she said. "Relatively speaking." I almost smiled. "Relatively speaking." She turned the portfolio to face me. Inside a single printed sheet, the filing confirmation from Sophie's law firm time-stamped 7:45 a.m., for the following morning, addressed to the Compliance Department of the bank's Commercial Accounts Division. Beside it, a second sheet, the notarized authorization document bearing my signature and the seal of a notary public in Alexandria, Virginia. Beside that, a third sheet, a summary of the Clause 14 Section B provisions annotated in Sophie's handwriting with the relevant case law and statutory references that would support immediate enforcement. I read through all 3 sheets. The freeze covers all accounts associated with the Sterling portfolio identifiers. Sophie said, her voice at the level of normal conversation, unhurried. Once the bank accepts the filing, any authorization document Diana presents, including the power of attorney from September, will be flagged as superseded. Their compliance protocol requires them to place a 48-hour hold on any subsequent transaction requests pending verification. "Morrison will tell her to contest it," I said. "He will." The contest process takes a minimum of 30 days. Within a few weeks, once the FBI filing is formally acknowledged, the freeze moves from bank-initiated to court-ordered. At that point, Morrison will stop returning her calls. I looked at the filing confirmation again. 7:45 a.m. Diana's appointment was at 8 o'clock. 15 minutes. Across 40 years, 15 minutes was a margin I could live with. The Eleanor statement, I said. Sophie opened the portfolio to the second section. A 4-page document typed on legal paper, notarized at the bottom of each page. Eleanor Voss of Hillcrest Drive, Virginia, a witnessed account of the night of November 14th, 20 years ago. What she had seen from her bedroom window. What she had heard. The timing of the ambulance call she had placed herself after waiting 40 minutes for someone in our house to call first. I read it slowly. Eleanor had remembered everything. The precision of her account, the specific times, the sequence of lights in the house windows, the exact words she had heard through her open bedroom window on a night that had been unseasonably warm for November, was the precision of a woman who had been carrying a detailed memory for 20 years and had never allowed herself to misplace a single element of it. She wrote most of it herself, Sophie said quietly. I just formatted it. I set the document down. She's a good woman, I said. She loved Mom, Sophie said. Simply without elaboration, the way you state a fact that requires no support. We went through the remainder of the portfolio in 40 minutes. The camera footage log, the medication evidence summary, the corporate ownership documentation for the Sterling subsidiaries, the birth record, and federal inmate registry for Caleb's father. Sophie walked me through each section with the clean, structured efficiency of someone presenting a case to a judge, which was in the most literal sense exactly what she was preparing to do. When we had finished, she closed the portfolio and looked at me across the table. Are you sure? She asked. Her voice was level, but I knew her well enough to hear what was underneath it. Not doubt, not hesitation, but the particular care of someone who wants to make certain that the person they love most has considered every dimension of what comes next. I looked out the window. On the street, the late afternoon light was doing what late afternoon light does in November in Virginia, turning everything briefly gold before the cold comes back. There's no road back from 20 years ago, I said. There never was. Sophie nodded once. Then she closed the portfolio, slid it into her bag, and stood up. I stood with her. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the small table in the rear corner of a coffee shop on Merchant Street. Two people who had spent a decade building toward a single day. She put her hand briefly on the table between us, not quite reaching across, but close. I placed mine beside hers. We didn't speak. Then she picked up her bag and walked out. At 11 o'clock that night, I lay in the dark in the attic room and waited. The phone vibrated at 11 exactly. 3 knocks, pause, 1 knock. I knocked twice on the headboard. Then, after a silence of perhaps 4 seconds, Sophie's voice, not in code, not in the stripped-down protocol we had used for 10 years, but her actual voice, quiet and clear through the earpiece, ready. 1 word, the only word that needed to be said. Ready, I said. I ended the call and set the phone down. Below in the main house, I could hear Diana and Caleb in the living room. The sound of glasses crystal the good set Diana had bought the first year we were married and had kept for occasions she considered worth celebrating. The particular bright note of a toast. They were celebrating early. I stared at the ceiling. The hairline crack ran from east wall to center unchanged, holding its position in the dark, the same as it held it in the light. I thought about 7:45 tomorrow morning. I thought about 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. I thought about Margaret's photograph in the workshop, safe face up, waiting. Then I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I thought. It ends tomorrow. I was in the kitchen at 7:30 when Diana came downstairs. She was dressed for the bank, a charcoal wool coat I had not seen before. A leather bag with a structured frame, the particular assembled quality of a woman who has decided that appearance is a form of argument. She moved through the kitchen with a purposefulness that was different from her usual morning pace, slightly accelerated the energy of someone approaching the conclusion of a long project. She did not offer to make me coffee. She poured her own, drank half of it, standing at the counter, and checked her phone twice in the space of 90 seconds. I have an appointment this morning, she said, not looking up from her phone. I'll be back by 10. All right, I said. She looked at me, then a brief assessment. the kind she performed automatically measuring my current state against her mental model of my trajectory. Whatever she saw satisfied her. She picked up her bag, collected her keys from the hook by the door, and left. I listened to her car back down the driveway and turn onto the road. Then I poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, the large one in the chair at the head, the one I had not sat in for 14 months, and opened the newspaper I had retrieved from the front step. The kitchen was very quiet. At 7:44, I thought about Sophie walking through the revolving doors of the First Colonial Bank branch on Commerce Street Portfolio, under her arm wearing the same gray blazer she had worn yesterday afternoon. I thought about her crossing the lobby to the commercial accounts window, setting the portfolio on the counter and removing the filing documents with the composed efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times, because in the relevant respects she had. At 7:45, I turned the page of the newspaper. At 8:03, I thought about Diana arriving at the same branch, pulling into the parking structure, walking through the same revolving doors with her structured leather bag and her charcoal coat, and the power of attorney document that Morrison's office had certified in October, and which had been, as of approximately 18 minutes ago, superseded by a filing she did not know existed. I read an article about infrastructure funding in the mid-Atlantic states. At 9:17, I heard Diana's car in the driveway. She came through the front door with the particular quality of stillness that is not calm, but its opposite, the absolute surface control of a person containing something that, if released, would be considerable. I had seen this quality in her once before, years ago, during a disagreement about a property transaction that had not gone as she intended. I had made a note of it at the time. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. I was still at the table, newspaper open, coffee cup at my right hand. "Oh, you called your daughter," she said. Her voice was level, not a question. "Sophie hasn't gone anywhere," I said. She never did. Diana came into the kitchen and set her bag on the counter. She did not sit down. Standing was for Diana a position of advantage. She had always preferred it in difficult conversations, and I had always let her have it because the mathematics of the situation had never depended on who was standing. "You don't understand what you've done," she said. I turned a page of the newspaper. "You said something similar to me once before, about 20 years ago. Different circumstances." A silence. "The bank will sort it out," Diana said. "Morrison has handled more complicated filings than whatever your daughter put together in a New York apartment." "Probably," I said. "Morrison is a competent attorney." "And then you understand this changes nothing." I looked up at her for the first time since she had come in. I held her gaze for a moment, the gaze of a woman who had spent 7 years managing me and was now recalibrating at speed, running through her available responses, selecting the one most likely to restore her position. "It changes the timeline," I said. "That's all I needed it to do." She studied me. I watched her doing it, the slight narrowing of focus that preceded her most careful assessments. "Who are you talking to?" she said. "Who have you been talking to?" Before I could answer, the front door opened, and Caleb came in from wherever he had been, his car, or the backyard, somewhere he had retreated to while Diana was at the bank. He stopped in the kitchen doorway behind Diana, taking in the scene, his mother standing at the counter in her bank, me at the head of the table with a newspaper. "What happened?" he said to Diana. "The filing was blocked," she said without turning around. "Temporarily." Caleb looked at me. His face moved through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, then calculation, then the particular anger of someone who has just understood that a situation he believed he controlled has developed dimensions he didn't account for. "You think you're done," he said. His voice had the sharp, slightly too loud quality of a man working to project a confidence he no longer fully felt. "Mom has a lawyer. You have some paperwork your daughter filed from New York." I folded the newspaper, set it down, pushed back the chair, and stood up. I was in that moment aware of something I had not allowed myself to feel for a very long time. A specific physical sensation located somewhere between the sternum and the throat. The sensation of a weight that has been carried so long you have forgotten it is there until the moment it begins, for the first time, to lift. I have considerably more than that, I said. But you're welcome to see it this afternoon. I picked up my coffee cup and moved toward the door. I've invited a few people over at 3 o'clock. I hope you'll both be here. I left them in the kitchen. Behind me, I heard Caleb say something to Diana in a lowered voice, too low for me to catch the words, but I didn't need the words. I knew the conversation. I had modeled it months ago, the specific exchange that would occur when the bank move failed, and they needed to recalibrate quickly. They would reassure each other. They would identify what they believed their remaining options were. They would decide that whatever I had arranged for this afternoon was manageable, that an old man's attempt at a countermove could be contained by a competent lawyer and a unified front. They would be wrong, but the believing would keep them in the house until 3 o'clock. That was all I needed. I went upstairs, changed my shirt, and sat at the attic desk for a moment, with my hands flat on the surface. 4 hours, I thought. 4 hours, and everyone will be in the same room. Before I go further, drop a 1 in the comments, so I know you're still with me. Because what's about to walk through that front door is something neither Diana nor Caleb saw coming. Not in 7 years. Not in 20. Note some moments ahead are fictional, built for entertainment, and to carry a message worth hearing. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, the exit is right there. But if you're staying, you won't regret it. The doorbell rang at 12:15. I was in the workshop when I heard it. The specific two-tone chime that Margaret had chosen when we installed the system, the same chime for 30 years unchanged. Because I had never seen a reason to change it, and Diana had never thought to. I set down the wrench I was holding, wiped my hands, and walked across the yard to the back door. By the time I reached the main hallway, Diana was already at the front door. I heard her open it. I heard the silence that followed, the particular quality of silence that occurs when a person opens a door and finds something on the other side that their prepared responses do not cover. Then I heard Sophie's voice. "Hello, Diana." I came around the corner into the hallway. Sophie was standing in the doorway, her gray blazer, her leather portfolio, her hair pulled back. Behind her, the stone pathway I had laid 30 years ago led back to the street where her rental car was parked. She looked exactly as she had looked yesterday afternoon at the coffee shop, which is to say, she looked like a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 10 years and had arrived at it without visible anxiety. Diana stood at the threshold with her hand still on the door handle. Her face had done something I had not seen it do before, not in 7 years of close observation, not in any of the scenarios I had modeled. For a fraction of a second, before her control reasserted itself, Diana's face showed something unguarded, something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but occupied the space between them. It lasted perhaps half a second. Then it was gone. "You're not welcome here," Diana said. Her voice was level. She had recovered quickly. She always recovered quickly. "I know," Sophie said. She stepped forward anyway, not aggressively, simply with the calm certainty of someone who has a legal right to be somewhere and is exercising it. Diana's hand tightened on the door handle for a moment, and then she stepped back. Sophie came inside. She looked at me. I looked at her. There was nothing that needed to be said in that exchange. 10 years of distance collapsed into a look, and then we both looked away because there would be time for what that distance had cost us, but this was not that time. Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs. He came down 3 steps and stopped looking at Sophie with an expression that moved from surprise to hostility, with the speed of someone who has been waiting for a reason to be hostile. and has just been given one. "What is she doing here?" he said to Diana. "She's leaving," Diana said. "Actually," Sophie said, crossing to the dining room table and setting her portfolio down, "I'm staying." She opened the portfolio and removed the top document, a copy of my original deed of trust, with the relevant sections tabbed. "This is my father's house. It has been my father's house since 1989, and I have a power of attorney that supersedes any document filed with Morrison's office executed and notarized 6 months ago, which gives me full legal authority to be present at any proceeding affecting my father's interests." She looked up. "Shall I read the relevant sections, or would you prefer to have your attorney review them?" Diana looked at me. I had moved to stand beside Sophie, not dramatically, not with any particular gesture. Simply crossed the room and taken the chair to her left, the way you sit down beside someone you have been sitting beside your entire life, because the distance between you has always been a temporary arrangement and not a permanent condition. "You planned this," Diana said, not to Sophie, to me. "Yes," I said. "For how long?" I considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. "She never really left," I said. "That was the plan from the beginning. When you made it clear in the second year of our marriage that Sophie's presence in this house was something you intended to manage until it became something you intended to eliminate, I made a decision. She would go, visibly, completely, in a way that satisfied you, and she would spend the time you gave her building something you wouldn't be able to dismantle." The room was quiet. Caleb came down the remaining stairs slowly, as though the information required physical processing. He stood at the edge of the room, looking between Diana and Sophie and me, recalibrating with the visible effort of someone whose model of a situation has just been replaced by a different and considerably more complicated one. 10 years, Diana said. 10 years, I confirmed. Sophie finished her law degree in year 2, passed the New York bar in year 3, joined the firm in year 4. The Sterling restructuring took years 5 through 7. The documentation assembly took years 8 through 10. I paused. She's a very thorough attorney. She gets that from her mother. Sophie did not look up from her portfolio, but the line of her jaw shifted, the particular micro-expression of someone choosing not to smile at something. Diana looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were doing what they did when she was thinking at speed, a very slight, very controlled movement the internal processing made briefly visible. "You don't know what you're doing," she said. Her voice had changed, not louder, not more aggressive, but different in register. Lower. The voice she used when she was speaking from somewhere genuine rather than from the managed surface. I looked at her. How to 20 years ago. I said, "On the night of November 14th, the telephone in this house did not work." I kept my voice even and unhurried. Every telephone, simultaneously. On a night when my wife was having a cardiac event that a 4-minute emergency call would have addressed in time to save her life. I paused. That has always seemed like a significant coincidence to me. Diana said nothing. "Not you were in the house," I said. "You told me afterward that you hadn't known anything was wrong until you heard me on the stairs. But Eleanor Voss, who lives 40 meters from our bedroom window, heard Margaret call out twice before midnight." Eleanor was awake. She waited to hear a phone call. She didn't hear one. At 6 in the morning, after the ambulance had already come and gone, Eleanor called me herself. I looked at Diana steadily. She's been thinking about what she heard for 20 years. She wrote it down, every detail, and she had it notarized last week. The silence in the room was of a different quality now. "I did not move until I had more than I needed," I said. "I told you this changes nothing. I was wrong about that. It changes everything. It has already changed everything. It changed at 7:45 this morning, and it will finish changing at 3 o'clock this afternoon." Diana looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "You'll find out that being right isn't the same as being happy." I held her gaze. "I'm not doing this to be happy," I said. "I'm doing this because you are owed it, and because Margaret is owed it, and because 20 years is long enough to wait for something that should have happened the morning after." The room was very still. From somewhere outside, a car passed on the road. The ordinary sound of an ordinary Friday afternoon, unremarkable and continuous, indifferent to everything happening inside these walls. Sophie placed a hand briefly on the table, not reaching for mine, just placing it there present. Not from 20 years ago, I thought. There was never any road back from that. Sophie and I worked through the Harmon file in the second-floor study. 11 pages. I read each one carefully, though I had seen preliminary versions of all of it before. There is a difference between preliminary intelligence and certified documentation. One is what you intend, the other is what actually stands. The financial records showed 31 months of wire transfers from Diana's account to Harmon's wife, $112,000, irregular in size and timing, the pattern of payment, for a service rather than any legitimate transaction. Behind that, the camera footage log from the unit I had installed in Harmon's waiting room 18 months ago, during 11 minutes when Diana had stepped outside to take a call. 6 sequences flagged as relevant. The most significant 4 minutes and 17 seconds of Harmon and Diana discussing my medication protocol in terms that, as Sophie wrote in her summary, would be difficult to characterize as consistent with legitimate medical practice. Difficult to characterize. Her language was always precise. The final section, prescription records, cross-referenced against therapeutic maximums. Average variance 240% above clinical guidelines. "He'll cooperate," Sophie said. "Kowalski confirmed this morning." "I know," I said. "Men like Harmon always cooperate when the alternative becomes clear to them." Sophie closed the portfolio. I looked out the window at the east garden, the beds along the south fence that needed work, the boxwood hedges overdue for their trim. Things I would have time for after today. The doorbell rang at 2:47. I went downstairs. Eleanor stood on the front step in her navy coat, the one she reserved for church, and what she called occasions that require looking like you mean it. She was holding a round tin in both hands and a small white envelope tucked under her arm. She handed me the tin first, still warm. Cinnamon and brown sugar, then the envelope. "Everything's in there," she said quietly. "The original and 2 certified copies. I wrote it myself. Sophie formatted it, but the words are mine." "I know," I said. "That's why it's going to matter." Eleanor nodded once. Then she looked past me into the hallway, past me to where Diana was visible in the living room, sitting with her phone waiting. Their eyes met across the distance. Diana's gaze held its usual assessment, the brief, dismissive evaluation of someone she had long ago decided was beneath her notice. Eleanor held that gaze for 3 full seconds without expression. Then she looked back at me. "Front row," she said. I stepped aside and let her in. At 10 minutes to 3, I went to the workshop one final time. I opened the safe and removed the last item I had been keeping for this specific moment, Margaret's graduation photograph. Face up on top of everything else, the way I had placed it the afternoon I found it in the garage donation boxes. Margaret laughing. Sophie's cap slightly askew. The brightness of that afternoon 30 years ago. I carried it upstairs to the second-floor hallway. The nail was still in the wall, set into a stud left there through all of Diana's redecorations, because it was too solidly placed to bother removing. I hung the photograph on it. I stood in front of it for a moment. I had promised this on the drive home from the hospital 20 years ago, through empty streets at 6 in the morning. I had not known then exactly what keeping the promise would require. Now I knew. And it was done. I went downstairs, crossed to the foot of the staircase, and raised my voice. Diana, Caleb." A pause. Come down to the living room, please. I'd like to sign something. Diana's phone call ended. Caleb's chair scraped back on the floor above. I walked into the living room. Eleanor was in the front chair. Hands-folded apple cake tin on the side table beside her. Sophie was at the dining table, portfolio open. Gerald Hayes, the notary who had driven from Alexandria that morning, sat to her right with his stamp and verification log. I sat down. Upstairs, footsteps on the landing. 3 o'clock, I thought. Right on time. Diana came into the living room first. She took in the arrangement, with a single sweep, Eleanor in the front chair. Sophie at the dining table with her portfolio, the notary, with his stamp and verification log, me seated in the chair I had always used, when this room was still the room I recognized. Her assessment lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she crossed to the sofa and sat down with the composed deliberateness of a woman who has decided that whatever is happening, she will not be the person who appears unsettled by it. Caleb came in behind her. He stopped in the doorway for a moment, looking at Sophie, then at Eleanor, then at me. He chose the armchair nearest the door, the position I noted of someone who wants to believe he has a quick exit available. Gerald Hayes cleared his throat softly. "Shall we begin?" I nodded. "I've asked everyone here today." I said, "Because I want to execute my will in the presence of witnesses." I looked around the room, Diana, Caleb, Eleanor, Sophie, Gerald. I think it's appropriate for the people most affected by its contents to be present when it's signed. Diana's expression did not change, but I saw her right hand resting on the sofa cushion beside her, pressed down slightly. The micro-gesture of a person applying a small controlled pressure to a surface, the physical equivalent of steadying oneself. Sophie removed a document from the portfolio and placed it on the table in front of Gerald. 12 pages typed on heavy cream stock bound with a single clip. Gerald reviewed the first page, confirmed the identification information, and looked up at me. "Now, Mr. Calloway, I'll need you to initial each page and sign the final page in the presence of these witnesses." "Of course," I said. I moved to the table. Gerald placed the document in front of me. I initialed each page in sequence slowly, with the care of a man performing a significant act, each initial placed precisely on its designated line. Diana watched from the sofa. I could feel the quality of her attention, the way you feel a change in air pressure not quite perceptible to the ordinary senses, but registering somewhere more basic. On the final page, I signed my full name, Walter James Calloway. Gerald dated the document, affixed his notarial seal, and signed the notary certification. Sophie signed as the first witness. Eleanor stood cross to the table and signed as the second witness, her signature careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the attention she brought to everything she considered important. She returned to her chair. Gerald collected the document, reviewed it one final time, and placed it in a protective sleeve. "Executed and certified," he said. "I'll file the registration copy with the clerk's office Monday morning." Diana looked at Sophie. "I'll have Morrison review it this afternoon." "You're welcome to," Sophie said pleasantly. She closed the portfolio. I returned to my chair. Diana looked at me with the expression of a woman who has just watched something happen and is not yet certain what it means, but is confident she can manage it. "Is that all?" she said. "Not quite," I said. "There's one more thing." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Sophie reached into the portfolio and removed a second document. Not the will, but a flat spiral-bound report, approximately 30 pages, printed on standard office paper with a cover sheet that read, in plain type, "Sterling Consolidated LLC Subsidiary Operations Summary, prepared for legal proceedings." She placed it on the coffee table in front of Caleb. He looked at it without picking it up. "What is this?" It's a summary of your gambling activity over the past 4 years," Sophie said. Her voice carried the same professional evenness she used for everything, the tone of someone presenting factual information that happens to be devastating. specifically your activity on 3 online gaming platforms: Black Edge Global Meridian Sports Exchange and Cascade Wagering. She paused. You've been a registered user on all 3 since their respective launch dates. Caleb looked at the cover sheet, then at Sophie. So the total amount wagered across all 3 platforms over 41 months is approximately $860,000. Sophie turned to the second page of the report and set it back on the table facing him. Your net loss position as of last Tuesday is $422,000. The room was very quiet. Lots of people gamble online, Caleb said. His voice had taken on the slightly elevated register of someone working to sound unconcerned. That's true, Sophie said. But most people who gamble online are not gambling on platforms owned by their stepfather. She placed a third document on the table, the corporate registry chain, the same one I had received by mail from New York a week ago. Black Edge Global Meridian Sports Exchange and Cascade Wagering are all registered to a Delaware holding company called Apex Digital Entertainment. Apex is wholly owned by a Nevada corporation called Pacific Ridge Holdings. Pacific Ridge is a subsidiary of Sterling Consolidated LLC. She looked at Caleb steadily. Sterling Consolidated is my father's company. Has been since 2004. The silence changed quality. I watched Caleb's face move through the stages of comprehension, the initial rejection, the recalculation, the moment when the arithmetic becomes impossible to deny. It was not a rapid process. He was not, as I had observed over 14 months, a man whose mind moved quickly when the information it was processing was unwelcome. He stopped, started again. You're saying he set up the platforms? Yes, Sophie said. 4 years ago. At which point you had already established a significant gambling habit on other platforms. The 3 Sterling subsidiaries offered better odds than their competitors. You migrated your activity to them within the first 6 months. She paused. The odds were better because they were designed to be attractive, not to be sustainable. Caleb stood up. Sit down, Sophie said. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. We're not finished. He stood for a moment, the posture of a man trying to determine whether leaving is still an option, running the calculation, finding that it isn't. Then he sat back down. Diana had not moved. She was looking at me, not at Sophie, not at the documents on the coffee table, but at me with an expression I had not seen before on her face. It was not anger. It was not fear, exactly. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has been playing chess and has just realized several moves too late that the board they have been looking at is not the board their opponent has been playing on. How long? She said. I looked at her across the room. I told you in the kitchen this morning, I said. She never really left. Before I reveal what was actually on that page, comment blank right now. Because in about 60 seconds, everything Diana built over 20 years is going to come apart. And the way it happens, nobody in that room saw it coming. Just a reminder, this story contains fictional elements added for entertainment and educational value. Some details may not reflect any specific situation. If that changes how you want to experience it, now's the time to step away. Otherwise, stay close. Gerald Hayes was reviewing the executed will one final time before placing it in his briefcase. Standard procedure, a final verification of completeness before a notary closes a file. Gerald had been informed before he arrived that this particular document served a demonstrative purpose, only carrying no legal weight. He had attended today not to certify a final instrument, but to witness a disclosure. He had agreed to that role in writing. He understood it. Still, when he turned to the last page and looked at what was there, Or rather, what was not there. He stopped. He turned the document over, looked at the first page, then the last. Then he set it flat on the table and looked at it without speaking. "Mr. Hayes," Sophie said. Gerald looked up. His expression was professionally neutral, but there was something underneath it, the particular careful blankness of a man who has encountered something outside his experience and is taking a moment to verify that he is seeing what he thinks he is seeing. He turned the document around and pushed it to the center of the table. The pages were blank, not damaged, not smeared, not faded in the way of old documents exposed to light. Simply blank, cream-colored stock, clean margins, not a mark on any of the 12 pages. The notarial seal was still there, pressed into the final page. Gerald's signature was still there in the certification block. The witness signatures were still there, Sophie's, Eleanor's, the date. But my signature was gone. Every initial was gone. Every word of the document's text was gone. The room was absolutely still for perhaps 3 seconds. Diana stood up. "That's not possible." "Thermochromic ink," I said. "It's a specialty printing compound. The text appears at room temperature and becomes invisible at approximately 40 degrees Celsius. The document was printed this morning. The living room has been warm for the past 2 hours. By now the ink has cycled through its full thermal range." I paused. "The process is completely reversible. If you put the document in a refrigerator for 20 minutes, every word will reappear exactly as written." Diana stared at the blank pages. "That document," I continued, "is not my will. It is a demonstration." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed a white envelope, letter-sized, unsealed, the flap tucked in. "This is my will. It was executed on March 14, 2004, before a notary in Richmond, and has been held in the custody of an independent law firm in that city for the past 21 years. It has been updated 3 times since then, most recently 8 months ago, and each update has been executed under the same custody arrangement." I placed the envelope on the table. "I'd suggest you read page 9, I said. "Specifically, clause 8. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Diana crossed to the table, picked up the envelope, and removed the document inside. She was controlled, her hands were steady, her movements deliberate. She turned to page 9. I watched her read. Whatever Diana's qualities, and she had many, not all of them contemptible, she was not a person who performed reactions. When something affected her, the effect was genuine even if the expression of it was managed. I watched the management fail as she read clause 8. Not dramatically, Diana did not do anything dramatically. But the slight, almost imperceptible change in the set of her jaw, the fraction of increased tension around her eyes, told me everything I needed to know about what she was reading. Sophie spoke into the silence. Clause 8 establishes an automatic forfeiture provision. In the event that any named beneficiary or any party acting on behalf of a named beneficiary is found to have engaged in conduct constituting elder abuse, financial fraud, undue influence, or any action designed to impair the testator's legal capacity or financial autonomy, that beneficiary's interest is immediately and irrevocably forfeited. She paused. The forfeiture is self-executing. It doesn't require a court order. It requires only documented evidence of the triggering conduct submitted to the trustee. Diana set the document down. "You can't prove any of this," she said. Her voice was level, the absolute, perfectly maintained level of a person who has nothing left but the performance of certainty. "The room agreement you presented me 5 days ago," I said. "The one I signed at the kitchen table on Monday morning. You'll remember I signed it without reading it carefully." I looked at her steadily. That was because I had already read it. I wrote the relevant section myself 3 years ago and inserted it into the template Diana's attorney used for all of our room agreements through a drafting error he has never discovered. Clause 14. Section B of that agreement states that any financial demand made upon the primary property owner by a co-resident in excess of fair market value constitutes documented evidence of undue influence for the purposes of the estate forfeiture provisions. I paused. $2,500 per month for a 12-square-meter attic room in a house worth $3 million is not fair market value. I paused again. You signed Clause 14, Section B yourself, 5 days ago, at the kitchen table while I was having my coffee. The room was very still. Diana looked at me. For the first time in 7 years of marriage, there was nothing behind her expression that I could not read. The management was gone. What was underneath was simply a person who has reached the end of a road and found it ending differently than they planned. Caleb made a sound, not quite a word, somewhere between a laugh and something less composed. This is... He stopped. You can't just... He stopped again. Fuiras. The forfeiture has already been submitted to the trustee, Sophie said. This morning at 8:15 electronically with full supporting documentation. She looked at Caleb. That includes the Sterling gaming records, the prescription documentation, the camera footage, and Clause 14, Section B of the executed room agreement. She closed the portfolio. The trustee has acknowledged receipt. You'll want to call Morrison, I said to Diana, not unkindly, simply as a practical observation. Though I'd suggest you do it quickly. His availability may become limited in the near future. Diana looked at me for a long moment. Her expression had settled into something I recognized not defeat, because Diana would never allow herself the simplicity of defeat, but a careful inward stillness. The stillness of a person recalibrating from the inside out, assessing what remains, preparing to continue by different means. I had seen that stillness before. It was the same stillness she had worn 20 years ago, in the days after Margaret died, when she had looked at this house and at me, and had begun very quietly to plan. She had planned for 20 years, so had I. The difference was in what we had each been planning for. And then from the front door, 3 knocks. Firm, evenly spaced the knock of someone who has been here before and knows the protocol of this house. Sophie stood up and walked to the door. Here we are, I thought. Right on time. Kowalski and Reyes stepped inside. Plain clothes, credentials, wallet, the particular economy of movement that comes from doing this long enough that every gesture is reduced to its necessary minimum. Kowalski looked around the room, Eleanor, Sophie, the documents on the table, Caleb still seated with the Sterling report in front of him. We were asked to be present as observers, he said. We'll stay until the disclosure is complete. Diana looked at the 2 agents, then at me. Sophie filed 6 months ago, I said. Agent Kowalski has been waiting for the complete package. As of this morning, it's complete. Sophie connected her laptop to the television above the fireplace and turned to face the room. 47 files, she said. Recorded on cameras installed throughout this property over the past 14 months. Agent Kowalski has reviewed the complete set and can speak to their evidentiary integrity. She pressed play. The footage ran 22 minutes. I watched Diana watch it. She was conducting a comprehensive internal audit, at speed identifying each piece, calculating its legal weight, determining what could be challenged. She reached the correct conclusion before the footage was halfway through. The conclusion was that none of it was challengeable in any way that would matter. The medication sequences alone. Diana handing me the ceramic dish each morning, watching me swallow. Collecting the dish documented across 14 months a pattern that combined with Harmon's prescription records and the 91 tablets in the Ziploc bag constituted evidence no defense attorney would take to trial. Then file 47. The dining room. Caleb at the table delivering his assessment of my value as a human being with the confidence of someone who believed he was completely unobserved. Sophie paused the footage. Caleb stood up. He pointed at me. You want to know the real story? Sophie hasn't called in 3 months. Has she faced it? Even your own blood moved on. She built a real life in New York with real people. You're just an obligation she forgot to cancel. He gestured toward Sophie without looking at her. At least I'm still here. Doesn't that tell you something about who actually gives a damn about you? 3 seconds of silence. Sophie placed her hand flat on the table beside mine. I'm here, Dad, she said. 2 words, carrying 10 years of everything that simplicity had cost. I looked at Caleb. File 48, I said. Added to the documentation package automatically. Thank you. I needed one more. Caleb sat down. Not dramatically, simply down the way a person sits when the structure beneath them has been removed, and sitting is what remains. Diana had not spoken during any of it. She had been thinking. When she spoke, her voice was precise and measured. None of this is admissible without proper authorization. More importantly, she looked at Kowalski. My husband lacks the legal capacity to authorize any of it. He was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's by a licensed physician 14 months ago. Any filing, any power of attorney, any instruction given during that period is voidable on grounds of incapacity. She reached into her bag and placed Harmon's clinical assessment on the table. I reached into my jacket and placed one document beside it. Johns Hopkins Medical Center, I said. Independent neurological assessment 10 weeks ago. Full battery MMSEMOCA neuropsychological evaluation fMRI. 91st percentile for my age cohort. No cognitive impairment of any kind. I looked at her steadily. Harmon's diagnosis is fabricated. He knows it. Kowalski's team has been in contact with Harmon's attorney for the better part of a month. The cooperation agreement was finalized 3 days ago. This morning was simply the delivery. Diana looked at the Johns Hopkins report. The management held for another moment. Then quietly, it didn't. Not dramatically, Diana never did anything dramatically. But the particular stillness she had maintained for 7 years shifted fractionally in a way I had never seen it shift before. The stillness of a person who has reached the end of a road and found it ending differently than planned. You prepared for everything, she said. I prepared for every way you might move, I said. In 40 years of practice, I designed buildings meant to stand 100 years. The difference between a structure that holds and one that fails is always in the preparation. The part nobody sees. The part done long before anyone is watching. I held her gaze. I've been preparing since the morning after Margaret died. Kowalski stepped forward from the doorway. I think, he said quietly, that it's time. I stood up, not with the careful, effortful deliberateness I had been performing for 14 months. Simply stood the way a person stands when they are done performing, and the room they are standing in finally matches the person they actually are. The difference must have been visible. I saw it register on Diana's face, a fractional recalibration, a recognition of something she was seeing for the first time, or perhaps acknowledging for the first time, which is not always the same thing. I looked around the room, Eleanor in her chair, hands folded, watching with the stillness of someone who has waited a long time for this and intends to be fully present for every second of it. Sophie at the table, her portfolio closed, her hands quiet. Kowalski and Reyes near the doorway. Caleb in his armchair looking at the floor. Diana on the sofa looking at me. I had prepared remarks. I had written them out 18 months ago on 3 pages of the composition notebook and revised them 4 times over the following year. By the time I had finished, I could have delivered them from memory with my eyes closed. I didn't use them. 20 years ago, I said, on the night of November 14th, my wife Margaret had a cardiac event. She was 51 years old. She was in good health. The prognosis, had she received emergency care within the first 30 minutes, was full recovery. I paused. She did not receive emergency care within the first 30 minutes. She received it 4 hours and 17 minutes after the event began, when the ambulance I called from the upstairs telephone, the one telephone in this house that was not malfunctioning that night, arrived too late. The room was very still. I came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found the kitchen telephone off the hook. The living room telephone had a severed line cleanly severed at the wall jack, consistent with a deliberate cut rather than accidental damage. The telephone in the master bedroom, which was the room where Margaret spent most of that night, was functional. It had not been used. I kept my voice even, not because I didn't feel the weight of what I was saying, but because the weight had been with me for 20 years, and I had learned across those years how to carry it without letting it show in my voice. Diana was in the house that night. She told me she had slept through everything. She told me she hadn't known anything was wrong until she heard me on the stairs at 6 in the morning. I looked at Diana. Eleanor Voss heard Margaret call out twice before midnight. Eleanor was awake in her bedroom 40 meters from ours. She heard the calls. She waited for a telephone to be made. She waited for 30 minutes. Then she waited another 30 because she told herself she must have misheard that surely someone in that house had already called. At 6 in the morning, after the ambulance had come and gone, Eleanor called me. I paused. She has been thinking about what she heard every day for 20 years. Last week she wrote it down. Every word, every timestamp, every light she saw in the windows of this house during the hours she was waiting. Eleanor did not move, but her hands folded in her lap, pressed together slightly, the gesture of a woman who is holding something carefully because it matters. The FBI has been investigating this case for 6 months, I said. The complete file, Eleanor's statement, the telephone records from that night, showing the call logs, the physical evidence documentation from the original death investigation that was closed prematurely, and the medical examiner's review conducted 2 years ago at Sophie's request, was submitted to Agent Kowalski this morning, along with the financial and medication documentation. I looked at Diana steadily. The cause of death in Margaret's case has been reclassified. Pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings, the official designation is now under investigation for homicide. The word sat in the room. Diana did not flinch. I had not expected her to. She looked at me with the expression of someone who is deciding in real time what posture to adopt, and then with the discipline that had always been her defining quality, she adopted it. Her spine straightened fractionally. Her hands moved to her lap. Her face settled into the composed neutrality of a woman who has been accused of something and intends to let the legal process determine what happens next. "You have nothing," she said. "You have an old woman's memory and a reclassified certificate." "And 47 camera files," Sophie said quietly. "And a cooperating witness. And Harmon's full statement, which he completed this morning, and which includes information about conversations that took place before you married my father." Diana looked at Sophie. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed Diana's face that I had no name for. Not guilt, exactly. Something older and more complicated than guilt. The expression of a person looking at the full length of a road they have traveled and seeing for the first time all of it at once. Then Kowalski stepped forward. The arrest took 11 minutes. Kowalski read Diana her rights in the living room, his voice the practiced, unhurried voice of someone performing a function he had performed many times. Diana listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I'd like to call my attorney." Kowalski said, "You'll have that opportunity at the field office." She nodded once, and that was all. Reyes handled Caleb, who did not take it as well. There was a brief, undignified interval during which Caleb said several things, most of them variations on the assertion that this was not legal and that people would hear about it, and Reyes waited with the patience of a man who has heard every version of this particular speech and found none of them interesting. Eventually, Caleb ran out of things to say and submitted to the process. I watched from the hallway as they were led out. Diana paused at the front door. She turned and looked back at the house, at the hallway, the staircase, the framed photograph on the second-floor landing that she would have been able to see from where she stood if she had looked up. She didn't look up. She looked at me. You'll find out, she said, that being right isn't the same as being happy. I looked at her for a moment. I know the difference, I said. I'm not doing this to be happy. I'm doing this because Margaret deserved someone who would wait as long as it took, and because you deserved to be here at this door on this day. I paused. I hope the next 20 years are instructive. Kowalski touched her arm lightly. She turned and walked down the stone pathway, the one I had laid 30 years ago, that had carried everything this house had ever seen, that would carry this too and still be standing when it was over. The car door closed. I stood in the doorway and watched until the vehicles turned onto the road and were gone. The house was very quiet. I went back into the living room. Sophie was at the table closing her portfolio with the systematic thoroughness she brought to the end of every piece of work. Eleanor was still in her chair. Gerald Hayes had packed his briefcase and was waiting near the door with the discreet patience of a professional who understands when he is no longer the most important person in a room. I thanked Gerald. He shook my hand and left. I sat down in the chair across from Eleanor. We didn't speak for a moment. The quiet of the room was different from the quiet it had held for the past 2 hours. No longer the quiet of suppressed tension, but the quiet of something finished. The particular silence that follows the resolution of a long and effortful thing. She looked at me the same way, Eleanor said finally, at the door. The same way she looked at me the morning after. She paused. I always wondered if she knew that I knew. She knew, I said. She decided you didn't matter. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have liked today, she said. She would have said something funny about it. She always said something funny. I thought about that. She would have, I agreed. Sophie came and sat beside me close enough that our shoulders were nearly touching. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. The three of us sat in the quiet living room as the late afternoon light moved across the floor, the same light that had always moved across this floor at this hour in this season, indifferent to everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. And then from the front step, 3 soft knocks. Eleanor looked up. I stood and went to the door and opened it. No one was there. But on the top step, set carefully against the doorframe, was the apple cake tin, a second one still warm through the foil, the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar rising into the cold air. Beside it, a small folded note in Eleanor's handwriting that she must have prepared before coming over and tucked into her coat pocket for this moment. For the 2 of you. Welcome home. I stood in the open doorway for a moment, the cold air on my face, the stone pathway stretching out before me in the last of the day's light. Behind me, I heard Sophie laugh, a short, genuine sound, surprised out of her. It was, I realized, the first time I had heard her laugh in 10 years. I picked up the tin and brought it inside. The house was quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet for a very long time. Sophie left at 9 o'clock. I listened to her car until the sound of it disappeared down the road, and then I stood in the hallway for a moment alone, in a house that was for the first time in 7 years actually mine. I went to the workshop. The safe was open. Sophie had taken everything that morning, the full documentation package transferred to her custody for the FBI proceedings. I crouched in front of it and looked at the empty interior. The USB drive was gone. The composition notebooks were gone. The manila folder, the photographs, the 14 months of accumulated evidence, all of it gone to where it needed to go. In the far corner, in the small lip, where the concrete had always created a natural shelf, there was one thing remaining. Margaret's key ring. 7 keys and 1 small brass key that fit no lock. Either of us had ever been able to identify. She had carried it for as long as I knew her. When I asked her once what it opened, she had smiled and said she'd forgotten, but it seemed too interesting to throw away. I held it in my palm for a moment. Then I carried it upstairs to the hallway outside the master bedroom and hung it on the small brass hook beside the graduation photograph, Margaret laughing Sophie's cap, askew the brightness of that afternoon 30 years ago. Not to use, just to be there, where it belonged. On Sunday morning, I made coffee and took it to the front step. The winter light was pale and honest, the way Virginia light is in the early morning in December, showing everything exactly as it is. The garden needed work. The south fence beds had been neglected. The boxwood hedges were overdue for their trim. There was a section of stone pathway near the gate that needed repointing. I had time for all of it. Eleanor came out of her house at 7:15 and walked to her mailbox. She saw me on the step. She raised her hand. I raised mine. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. 31 years of knowing someone well enough to understand what a raised hand means at 7 in the morning, that's its own kind of language. I drank my coffee and thought about the question people would ask, and had already begun to ask in the days since Friday. Was it worth it, 20 years of waiting? Everything it cost. I knew the answer to that question. The harder question, the one I suspected I would think about for whatever years remained, was what Margaret would have said about all of it. Eleanor was right. She would have said something funny, something that made the whole weight of it briefly lighter. I hadn't figured out what that something was yet. Maybe that was all right. Maybe some things are allowed to stay open. I set down my coffee cup and looked at the garden in the morning light. The stone pathway, the boxwood hedges, the south fence beds waiting for spring. There was work to do. I went inside, put on my coat, and started. 20 years is a long time to carry something. Long enough that you stop noticing the weight until the morning you set it down and feel for the first time in longer than you can remember what it is to simply stand upright. Whatever you're carrying, I hope you find your morning. And if you did tell me how long did you wait, I've told you this story because I lived it. Don't be like me. Don't wait 20 years to protect the people you love. Don't stay silent when silence becomes a weapon used against you. The moment you feel something is wrong, build something. Say something. Because 20 years is a long time to carry a weight that was never yours to carry alone. God put the right people in my life at the right time, a daughter who never stopped believing, and a neighbor who never forgot what she witnessed. Without them, none of this ends the way it did. Here's my personal truth. In every family story, the real fight is never about money. It's about dignity, about what you're willing to stand for. This Grandpa Stories isn't unique. It's happening behind closed doors everywhere. Most people never find their way out. I was one of the lucky ones. If this Grandpa Stories moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me your own family story. And if you believe every Grandpa Stories deserves to be heard, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. Note: some stories on this channel include fictional elements crafted purely to illuminate real human truths. If that's not for you, no judgment, find what serves you. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next story.